They stood trembling on the auction block, too tall, too poor, too unwanted. But just before the hammer dropped, one voice rose above the crowd. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. And in that moment, everything changed. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a bullwhip against the scorching Nevada sun. $15? Do I hear 15 for the whole lot? The crowd of miners, gamblers, and drifters murmured with cruel anticipation. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Virginia City like the devil's own furnace, bleaching the false fronts of saloons and casting harsh shadows between the hitching posts. Women in faded bonnets peered from beneath their parasols. Men in sweat-stained Stetsons leaned against the wooden sidewalks with arms crossed and eyes calculating, but nobody stepped forward. Not yet. On the makeshift platform built from old mine timbers stood a woman whose imposing height made her impossible to ignore, though she tried desperately to shrink into the shadow of the hanging tree overhead. Her name was Elena Ramirez, and beside her stood 4 children, arranged by age like steps on a staircase, all bearing her dignified posture, broad shoulders, and steady gaze despite the fear trembling in their young limbs. She held the youngest, a dark-haired girl of maybe 4, while the others pressed close like tumbleweeds seeking shelter from a desert storm. None of them spoke. None dared. "Going once," barked the auctioneer, his voice wavering in the oppressive heat. "A complete family unit, strong backs, proven workers. Make them yours for $15 silver and solve your labor shortage through the mining season." A few prospectors chuckled meanly. "They'd eat more beans than they're worth," someone called from the crowd. "Whole clan of giants, that bunch." Elena didn't flinch. Not when the word giants cut through the desert air like a Bowie knife thrust. She'd heard worse in 2 languages. She'd survived worse. The booming mining town of Virginia City had always seen her family as too much, too tall, too proud, too Mexican, too everything that didn't fit their narrow expectations. When her husband Roberto died in a silver mine collapse 8 months back, the mining company waited exactly 1 week before arriving with papers about company housing and unpaid medical debts. Now here she stood barefoot on sun-bleached planks, her family priced at less than a decent mule. Shame pressed down on her shoulders like the weight of the Nevada mountains, but she kept her chin raised anyway. Her children needed to see strength, even if her knees felt ready to buckle beneath her. A dust devil swirled through the street, lifting ladies' skirts and stirring the hem of Elena's black morning dress. Her second son, Miguel, age 13, reached to hold the fabric down with trembling brown hands. The only daughter among the older children, little Rosa, pressed against his side. Her eldest, Fernando, just 17, stood rigid as a fence post, jaw clenched tight, one arm protectively behind his siblings' backs as if he could shield them from every hungry stare in that merciless crowd. No one bid. Not a single voice called out a price. The silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope in the desert sun. And then it shattered. "They're mine." The words didn't echo across the square. They didn't shout or demand attention. They fell low, steady, absolute as gravity. Yet every person in that crowd turned toward the voice like a rifle shot had split the air. At the far end of the street, a man sat astride a massive draft horse, the kind bred for pulling or wagons through mountain passes. His wide-brimmed hat cast his weathered face in deep shadow. He wore the practical clothes of a mountain man: buckskin jacket, wool pants reinforced with leather patches, and boots that had walked every dangerous mile of the Sierra Nevada. Most folks couldn't see his features clearly, but those with sharp eyes caught sight of the enormous Sharps rifle slung across his back and the way he sat his horse like a man who owned whatever ground he happened to be occupying. His name was Hank Bigfoot Hunter, though the nickname didn't come from his shoe size, which was considerable, but from his legendary ability to track anything that moved through the wilderness. He could follow a deer's trail 3 days after a rainstorm, find a lost child in country that would swallow a cavalry regiment, and hunt down claim jumpers in terrain that defeated experienced prospectors. Standing 6 feet 6 inches in his stocking feet and weighing near 250 pounds of bone and muscle hardened by 20 years in the mountains, Hank was a man who commanded respect from grizzly bears and claim jumpers alike. He'd started as a fur trapper in the Rocky Mountains, survived the collapse of the beaver trade, turned to prospecting during the California Gold Rush, and eventually found his calling as a tracker and guide for folks brave or foolish enough to venture into the wild places. His reputation stretched from the Colorado Territory to the California coast. If something was lost in the mountains, Hank Bigfoot Hunter could find it. If someone needed safe passage through hostile territory, Hank could provide it. If justice needed serving in places where no law existed, Hank would serve it with his Sharps rifle and his own moral code. The auctioneer squinted against the sun, clearly flustered. "I beg your pardon, mister?" Hank dismounted with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to respect mountain terrain. His boots hit the dirt with authority that seemed to make the very ground settle. "I said they're mine. You want $15 for the lot. I'll pay $30. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through dry sagebrush. Even the mockers fell silent, necks craning to get a better look at the mountain giant who'd spoken up for a Mexican family nobody else wanted. "Name's not on the bill," the auctioneer stammered, fumbling with his sweat-stained papers. "Territory says they're unclaimed property. Technically belonging to the, well, nobody specific. You certain about this, mister?" Hank ignored him completely. His dark eyes were fixed on the family. On Elena Ramirez, who stared at him like he was some fever dream conjured by desperation and desert heat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades giving orders to pack trains and rescue parties. "You want out of this situation? Come with me." Elena didn't move at first. Her arms tightened around the little girl. "Mama," Miguel whispered urgently in Spanish. Fernando narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "¿Quién es este hombre?" "No lo sé," she replied, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "But something tells me he means exactly what he says." Hank extended his massive hand, not to her, but to Fernando. The boy looked at it, then at the mountain man's steady gaze, the way he held himself like someone who'd never backed down from anything worth fighting for. Something passed between them, protector to protector, man to man despite Fernando's youth. The boy stepped off the platform and took the offered hand with a grip that surprised both of them with its firmness. That was enough. The rest followed. They walked off that platform not in chains or shame, but side by side with a stranger who wore his quiet authority like armor around them all. Hank lifted the youngest onto his shoulders without asking permission. The little girl, Esperanza, didn't cry or struggle, just gripped his hat with tiny fists and looked out over the crowd like she was surveying her new domain from the safety of a watchtower. Elena followed with the others, passing through a corridor of stunned silence. The townspeople parted without speaking, some out of respect, others from simple intimidation. A few women turned away, unable to watch. One man spat tobacco juice in the dust, but Hank didn't acknowledge him. His focus was forward, always forward, the way a man learned to think when survival depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. By the time they reached his enormous draft horse, Hank had already untied his pack mule and gestured for the family to gather their few possessions. Fernando helped Miguel climb onto the mule's broad back. Elena held Rosa close to her side. Esperanza giggled from her perch on the mountain man's shoulders, already trusting him with the complete faith that only children could manage. "¿A dónde vamos?" Elena asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank adjusted Esperanza's grip on his hat and looked westward toward the purple peaks of the Sierra Nevada. "Somewhere the law can't follow with papers and threats." The words fell heavy and final. Not a question, not a promise. Just a direction toward freedom. They rode northwest for the rest of that burning day, saying little as the desert landscape rolled out in waves of sagebrush and red rock, broken only by the shadows of hawks circling overhead and the distant promise of mountains that meant cooler air and better water. Elena watched Hank from behind, trying to understand the man who'd bought them, not like livestock to be owned, but like people worth saving. He didn't ask questions about their past, didn't offer empty sympathy or judgment about their circumstances. He just rode with the practiced silence of a mountain guide, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble that might be following. Esperanza had fallen asleep against his neck, tiny fingers still tangled in the red bandana that marked him as a man of the wilderness. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of copper and gold, they reached a hidden canyon where a natural spring bubbled up from deep underground limestone. Hank dismounted first, lifting Esperanza down gently before helping the others from their mounts. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, already moving to unsaddle the horses. Water's sweet, sheltered from wind, and anyone trying to follow would have to announce themselves coming down that narrow passage. Fernando started gathering firewood without being asked, his movements efficient despite his exhaustion. Miguel helped Rosa down from the mule. Elena just stood for a moment, feeling the cool air rising from the spring, listening to the peaceful sound of water flowing over smooth stone. It was the first truly peaceful sound she'd heard in months of fear and uncertainty. Hank built the fire with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd done it thousands of times. Small, smokeless, positioned to reflect heat off the canyon wall while remaining invisible from above. He shared his trail rations without comment: hardtack, jerked venison, and beans that he somehow managed to make taste almost good in his old camping pot. After they'd eaten, the children huddled close to their mother for warmth and comfort. Esperanza had woken up cranky and wanting her mama, reaching for Elena with sleepy complaints. She took the child gratefully, settling her against her chest where she belonged. "¿Por qué nos ayudaste?" Elena asked Hank in Spanish, then translated herself. "Why did you help us?" Hank stared into the dancing flames for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting memories from years past. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Had a younger brother once. About Rosa's age when the tax collectors came to our homestead in Missouri. After the war ended, carpetbaggers said we owed back taxes on land that had been in our family for generations. Said we had to sell to pay them." He paused, turning a stick in the flames. "Nobody stood up. Nobody spoke for us. They took Tommy to work in a textile mill up in St. Louis. What happened to him? Don't know. Never saw him again. Heard he died of lung fever before his 15th birthday." Silence settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, more respectfully. "This ain't charity," Hank continued. "This is settling a debt I've carried for 15 years. The next morning they rode deeper into wild country, following old Indian trails that Hank knew from his years as a guide and tracker. The landscape grew more beautiful but also more dangerous. These were lands where the Paiute and Shoshone had fought settlers to a standstill for decades, where a man could disappear without a trace and never be found. "No tienes miedo?" Elena asked as they paused to water the animals at another hidden spring. Hank checked his massive Sharps rifle, eyes automatically scanning the ridgelines for movement. "Fear's a tool, senora. Keeps you alive if you listen to it, gets you killed if you don't." They climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails through pine forests that smelled of resin and cool mountain air. By evening they reached a high meadow where an old trapper's cabin sat hidden among the trees, its log walls still solid despite years of weather and neglect. "This was mine," Hank said, dismounting. "Built it myself 7 years ago during a hard winter when I was snowed in for 4 months." He looked around at the familiar structures: the main cabin, a lean-to stable, a smokehouse, even an old cache pit where he'd stored supplies. "Been empty since I started spending winters down in the valley." Fernando inspected the cabin while Miguel and Rosa explored the stable area. The buildings were sturdy, built by a man who knew how to make things last in country that tested everything. There was even a well with good water and an old vegetable garden gone wild but recoverable with work. "We can stay here?" Elena asked, hardly daring to hope. "Long as you want. Nobody's coming to collect rent on government land nobody knows about." That first night, Hank gave the family the main cabin and slept in the stable like he was still on a long hunting expedition. He cooked breakfast over an open fire, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, bacon thick as shoe leather, and biscuits that weren't half bad for a mountain man's cooking. Esperanza laughed when Hank let her bang on an old pot with a wooden spoon, making music that echoed off the canyon walls. By the third day, the children had stopped jumping at every unexpected sound. By the fifth, Elena was humming while she swept, and Hank had taught Fernando the proper way to clean and maintain the Big Sharp's rifle. By the 7th day, they'd begun to feel like a family instead of refugees. But peace in wild country was always temporary, and trouble had a way of finding you no matter how far you ran. The riders didn't approach slowly or carefully. They came thundering up the mountain trail like the territorial marshal's posse they were, badges gleaming in the afternoon sun, horses lathered with sweat and pushed too hard for the thin mountain air. Hank was checking his trap lines with Fernando and Miguel when he heard the sound of shod hooves on stone echoing up from the valley below. His wilderness instincts kicked in instantly. "Fernando, take your brother and get to the cabin. Bar the door from inside. Don't open it unless you hear my voice or your mother's calling all clear." The boy nodded once and ran, pulling Miguel with him across the meadow. Hank moved to his defensive position behind a fallen log, Sharp's rifle loaded and ready. From here he could see the trail approach and the cabin both, with clear shots in all directions. 8 riders crested the meadow's edge, led by a thin man in a black coat with a federal marshal's badge pinned prominently to his vest. His face was sharp as a hatchet blade, eyes pale and cold as winter ice. Behind him rode 7 deputies, all heavily armed, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else than hunting families in the high country. The marshal dismounted slowly, deliberately, making a show of brushing trail dust from his expensive coat. "I'm Federal Marshal Cornelius Black," he called out toward the cabin. "Looking for a man goes by Hank Hunter. Wanted for theft of bonded property and interference with federal commerce." Hank stepped out from cover, rifle held low but ready for instant action. "I'm here. And the only thing I stole was a family from being sold like cattle." Marshal Black smiled without any warmth reaching his cold eyes. "Legal sale under territorial debt recovery laws. That family belongs to the Consolidated Silver Company now. They have legal obligation to work off mining debts." "Since when does a mining company own people?" "Since the territory needs workers and can't afford to be sentimental about labor shortages." Black gestured to his men, who spread out in a loose semicircle designed to eliminate any escape routes. "Now step aside, Hunter. We're taking them back to fulfill their contractual obligations." Hank didn't move an inch. Behind him, he heard the cabin door creak open slightly. Elena appeared on the threshold, Rosa pressed against her side, Esperanza balanced on her hip. "There ain't no contracts," Hank said evenly. "Just a piece of paper saying human beings are for sale. That ain't law. That's something else entirely." Black's hand drifted toward the polished pistol at his hip. "You questioning federal authority, mountain man?" The insult hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Hank's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. The look of a man who'd been underestimated by city folks his entire life and had learned exactly how much their opinions were worth. "I'm questioning you," he said quietly. "And I'm telling you to ride back down that trail before this situation gets unpleasant for everyone involved." Black laughed, a sharp bark that echoed off the surrounding peaks. "You think one overgrown trapper can stand against federal law and 8 armed deputies? Let's find out." That's when Fernando appeared at the cabin window, Hank's spare rifle pointed steadily at Black's chest. The boy had learned to shoot hunting deer and elk, but his hands were rock-steady now. Behind another window, Miguel held an old percussion pistol that looked oversized for his 13-year-old hands but was aimed true enough to matter. Black's deputies shifted nervously in their saddles. This wasn't what they'd signed up for, a mountain fortress defended by children and a legendary tracker who looked like he'd rather die than surrender what he protected. "You're making this more difficult than necessary," Black said, but his voice had lost some of its commanding authority. "No," Hank replied calmly. "You are." The standoff stretched like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. 8 federal men against 1 mountain man and a family of refugees. But Hank had learned something in 20 years of wilderness survival. It wasn't always about numbers or superior firepower. Sometimes it was about who was willing to pay the ultimate price for what they believed in. Marshal Black made his choice. He drew his pistol with the speed of a man who'd practiced the motion 10,000 times. Hank was faster. The massive Sharp's rifle spoke once, its boom rolling across the meadow like thunder from a summer storm. Black's hat flew off his head, ventilated clean through with a hole you could put your thumb through. The marshal stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock, hand frozen halfway to his weapon. "Next shot won't be a warning," Hank said calmly, working the rifle's lever to chamber another of the enormous cartridges. "Now mount up and ride out of my mountains." One of the deputies, young and nervous, was already backing his horse toward the trail. Another followed quickly. But 5 remained, hands on their weapons, waiting for orders from their humiliated leader. Black's face flushed red with fury and wounded pride. "This is treason against territorial authority, Hunter. I'll have the army down here before." "The army's got bigger problems than one family trying to stay together," Hank interrupted. "And they know me from the Indian campaigns. Might want to check with Colonel Morrison at Fort Churchill before you start making threats you can't back up." Black's jaw worked like he was chewing bitter medicine. Colonel John Morrison commanded the military district, and every lawman in Nevada Territory knew his reputation for fairness and his intolerance for corruption. He'd fought Washington bureaucrats before over unjust treatment of civilians. "This isn't finished, Hunter." "Bring all the paper you want," Hank replied. "I'll be waiting." Black holstered his weapon and mounted his horse with wounded dignity intact but authority clearly shaken. His deputies followed, some reluctantly, others with visible relief at avoiding bloodshed. As they rode back down the canyon trail, kicking up dust and loose stones, one called back over his shoulder, "They'll send real soldiers next time, Hunter." Hank watched them disappear around the bend, then lowered his rifle. The children emerged from the cabin cautiously, Fernando still gripping the spare rifle but his hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Will they come back?" Rosa asked in Spanish, her young voice tight with fear. Hank knelt to her level, his weathered face serious but reassuring. "Probably, Nina. But when they do, we'll be ready for them." That night, the family ate by firelight in the cozy cabin. Hank had found an old harmonica in his gear, and after much coaxing from Esperanza, he played a few songs, old mountain ballads, songs his own father had taught him back in Missouri, and one Mexican lullaby he'd learned from a vaquero during his prospecting days in California. Elena listened with tears streaming down her cheeks. It had been so long since her children had heard music, since they'd felt safe enough to sing along without fear of attracting unwanted attention. "Como aprendiste esa canción?" she asked about the lullaby. "Good guide learns the languages of the land he's traveling," Hank replied, fingers still moving expertly on the instrument. "And the songs of the people he's trying to help." But safety in territorial country was always borrowed time, and the debt always came due when you least expected it. On the 10th day, they saw the first scout, a lone rider who stayed just within telescopic sight on the distant ridge, watching through field glasses before disappearing at sunset. The 11th day brought clear sign that someone had been near their spring at night, boot prints in the mud, horse droppings that weren't there when the sun went down. The 12th day, Hank found a formal notice pinned to the stable door with a cavalry saber. No signature, but the legal language was unmistakably clear. Return the stolen property by sunset tomorrow or face the full consequences of treason against territorial law and federal commerce. Hank burned the notice in the evening fire while the children watched with wide, frightened eyes. Fernando had taken to sleeping with his rifle across his chest. Miguel sharpened wooden stakes like he was preparing for siege warfare. Even little Rosa helped gather stones to use as ammunition for the slingshot Hank had carved for her. Elena packed traveling bundles but left them by the door rather than loading them onto the animals. She wasn't ready to run again. Not yet. Not when they'd just begun to feel like they belonged somewhere. "They'll bring more men this time," she said as they sat on the cabin steps, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. "I know," Hank replied. He cleaned his rifle methodically, checking every component like he had every evening for 20 years of mountain living. But running won't stop them forever. They'll follow that legal paper anywhere it's recognized. "Y.S.I. perdemos la peli?" He looked at her, this strong woman who'd kept 4 children alive through grief, poverty, and desperation. "Then we lose fighting on our own terms instead of running scared. Your children deserve that much dignity." It was on the 15th day that the real test arrived. Not more marshals this time, something far worse. A telegram delivered by a Pony Express rider who looked like he'd rather be delivering rattlesnakes. The young rider was nervous and sweating despite the cool mountain air. He handed over the yellow telegram like it might explode in his fingers. Hank read it twice, his face growing darker with each carefully worded line. "What does it say?" Fernando asked, his voice tight with dread. Hank folded the telegram carefully, as if handling something dangerous. "Says the Consolidated Silver Company filed a federal claim under the new Territorial Labor Recovery Act. Your family's been classified as indentured servants to pay mining company debts. Military escort arriving tomorrow to enforce federal collection orders." "Military?" Elena's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she reached instinctively for Esperanza. "Federal cavalry. Not territorial marshals or company-hired guns. Real soldiers with real authority." The weight of that news settled over them like a funeral shroud. Hank had faced claim jumpers, hostile Indians, Mexican bandits, and every variety of dangerous wildlife the mountains could produce. But fighting other American soldiers, men who wore the same flag he'd served under during the war, that was something entirely different and infinitely more complicated. That evening, as the children slept peacefully for what might be their last night of safety, Hank sat with Elena on the porch steps, both of them staring into the darkness beyond the canyon mouth where their enemies would soon appear. "I could take them deeper into Paiute territory," he said quietly. "There are hidden valleys up there where the tribes still live free. Some of the chiefs remember me from the peace talks. They might take you in. And you." The Paiute have long memories. They remember who fought against them, even respectfully. She was quiet for a long time, considering options that all seemed impossible. "Then, I won't let my children grow up hiding in caves like hunted animals. Then we make our stand here. Against federal cavalry soldiers?" He turned to look at her directly. "I took an oath during the war to defend freedom and justice. Any law that lets companies buy families like their livestock, that's an enemy of everything I swore to protect." Dawn came too soon, announced by the disciplined sound of hoofbeats echoing up from the canyon below. Not the chaotic thunder of marshals in a hurry, the measured, practiced cadence of cavalry on patrol. Hank counted by sound alone, at least 25 horses, moving in perfect military formation. He'd prepared as thoroughly as possible given their limitations. The cabin windows were barricaded with furniture, leaving only narrow firing ports that provided cover while allowing clear shots. The stable had been cleared to use as a fallback position if the cabin became untenable. Water barrels and ammunition were distributed between both buildings. Fernando and Miguel knew their positions and understood their responsibilities. But as the blue-clad column emerged onto the high meadow, Hank's heart sank like a stone. These weren't territorial militia or company mercenaries with questionable loyalty. These were 2nd Cavalry troopers, disciplined and experienced Indian fighters, led by a captain he recognized from the campaigns against Geronimo. Captain Samuel Morrison was a career soldier who'd served with distinction in the Civil War and the Indian conflicts that followed. He was a fair officer who treated his men well and civilians with proper respect. Hank had worked with him before as a civilian scout and guide. Now he'd have to fight him. The column halted 50 yards from the cabin, horses snorting and stamping in the thin mountain air. Captain Morrison rode forward alone, his hands clearly visible on his reins in a gesture of peaceful intent. "Hank Hunter," he called out, using the mountain man's full name. "I truly hoped the reports were wrong about this situation." Hank stepped onto the porch, rifle held across his chest in a position that wasn't quite threatening but left no doubt about his readiness. "Captain Morrison, can't say I'm surprised to see you, but I wish circumstances were different." "Stand down, Hank. Don't make me arrest a man I respect." "Can't do that, Captain. Family's under my protection, and I don't break my word." Morrison removed his hat and wiped sweat from his brow, clearly uncomfortable with his orders. "Hank, listen to me carefully. This directive comes from the territorial governor, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Secretary of War himself. This is bigger than one family's troubles." "No, sir, it isn't. It's exactly one family. For children and their mother who've lost everything except each other. That's as big as anything gets in this world." Behind the cabin windows, Hank could sense rather than see the family watching and waiting. Fernando would be at the north window with the hunting rifle Hank had taught him to use. Miguel would be at the south window with the old pistol. Elena would have Rosa and Esperanza hidden in the root cellar beneath the floor planks. Captain Morrison sighed deeply, the sound of a good man trapped by bad orders. They're not slaves, Hank. It's contract labor under the new territorial debt laws. Completely legal according to federal statute. Legal ain't the same thing as right, Captain. You know that as well as I do. I know I have my orders from superior officers. And I have my conscience and my word to keep. The standoff stretched taut between two men who'd fought side by side against common enemies, now facing each other across an impossible moral divide created by politicians and mining company lawyers. Then Captain Morrison made a decision that would echo through both their lives forever. He turned in his saddle to address his troopers with clear, unmistakable authority. Company, about face. Prepare to return to base. The cavalry column wheeled their horses in perfect formation, preparing to ride back down the canyon they just climbed. But as they began to move, Morrison called out one final time. Hunter, if I were you, I'd consider relocating to California. Soon as possible. Hank nodded once, understanding the warning perfectly. Much obliged for the advice, Captain. As the cavalry disappeared back into the canyon, their hoofbeats fading like distant thunder during a summer storm, Hank felt the full weight of what had just happened. Morrison had disobeyed direct federal orders. He'd chosen friendship and conscience over military duty and legal obligation. It was a choice that would probably cost him his commission and possibly his pension. That night, Hank explained to the family what Morrison had really been communicating with his warning. We've got maybe a week before they send someone who won't turn back. Someone without personal history to complicate their orders. California? Fernando asked, already thinking like the man he was rapidly becoming. Could work. California's got different laws, more protection for immigrants and refugees. But it's dangerous country to cross. Desert that kills the unwary, mountain passes that avalanche without warning, bandits who prey on travelers. Elena held Esperanza close, rocking slightly as she considered their options. How far to California? 4 days of hard riding if we push. Maybe 6 with the children and staying careful. And after California? What kind of life could we build there? Hank had been thinking about that question since Morrison rode away. There's talk of the Homestead Act being extended to California territory. Governments offering land grants to anyone willing to settle and defend the frontier regions. Work the land, prove it up, and it becomes yours with clear legal title. Start over completely? With American papers this time. Real ones that can't be overturned by mining company lawyers or corrupt territorial officials. The decision made itself over the course of that long, sleepless night. They would leave at dawn, take only what they could carry, and make the dangerous journey to California. Hank spent the evening hours checking weapons, planning routes through treacherous country, and writing detailed instructions for Fernando in case he didn't survive the journey ahead. But when dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, it brought unexpected visitors instead of departure. 5 Indian warriors sat their horses at the canyon mouth, painted for war, armed with both traditional weapons and modern rifles. Their leader, a man Hank recognized immediately despite the years that had passed, dismounted and walked forward with the easy confidence of someone who owned every acre his eyes could see. Bigfoot Hunter, the Indian said in careful English. I am Chief Joseph Standing Bear of the Northern Paiute. You remember me? Hank set down his rifle and walked out to meet him. Following Indian protocol, he held up his right hand, palm open, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. I remember you, Chief. You helped me find those lost miners near Pyramid Lake 5 winters ago. And you shared your meat when our children were hungry during the hard winter. You treated our wounded when other white men would have left them to die. They had met during one of the last peaceful encounters between Indians and whites in the region. Hank's tracking party had found wounded Paiute warriors after a skirmish with claim jumpers, and despite the risks, he'd shared his supplies and helped transport the injured to their tribal healers. It was a small act of humanity in increasingly inhuman times. "What brings you to my mountains?" Hank asked, though he suspected he already knew. Standing Bear gestured toward the cabin where Elena and the children watched nervously from the windows. "The Mexican woman and her cubs. The white authorities hunt them like animals. This troubles my people greatly. Why should it concern the Paiute? My first wife was Mexican. Captured as young woman, became Paiute through marriage, gave birth to strong warriors. Your Mexican woman has same fierce spirit. Her children have hearts like our own children. My council has voted. We offer our protection." Hank felt the entire situation shift beneath his understanding. "You're offering sanctuary in Paiute territory? In our hidden valleys where white man's law cannot reach. Safe from all their paper and their threats." It was an incredible offer, unprecedented in Hank's experience. The Paiute had been fighting encroaching white civilization for generations. For them to offer protection to a Mexican family and a white mountain man was virtually unheard of. But Hank also understood what accepting would mean. Your people would be hunted for harboring us. The government doesn't forgive or forget. Standing Bear's weathered face showed what might have been a smile. My people are already hunted for being who we are. What difference does it make if we're hunted for doing what's right? That evening, inside the warm cabin, Hank explained the choice to Elena and the older boys. California meant starting over with nothing but freedom and the possibility of legal land ownership. Paiute protection meant safety but life as permanent outsiders, cut off from civilization and always moving to stay ahead of government forces. What do you think we should do? Elena asked. I think your children deserve to grow up somewhere they can put down real roots. Build something lasting. Indian life is a good life for Indians, but it's a hard life for everyone. Always moving, always hiding, always one step ahead of trouble. Fernando spoke up with the seriousness of someone forced to mature too quickly. What about you? What do you want for yourself? Hank looked around the cabin, at Rosa teaching Esperanza to count with dried beans, at Miguel carefully cleaning his rifle, at Fernando trying to shoulder responsibilities too heavy for his 17 years, at Elena who'd kept them all together through everything that had tried to tear them apart. I want what I never had growing up, he said finally. A real family. A place to truly belong. Land to work and build on instead of just survive in. California then, Elena said with quiet determination. We go together or we don't go at all. The next morning, Chief Standing Bear returned with supplies. Water skins made from elk hide, dried meat, even a small pouch of silver coins that caught the sunlight. For the journey ahead, he said solemnly, and for remembering that some white men still understand honor. Hank clasped the Paiute chief's weathered arm in farewell. If we make it through, I'll send word back through the trading posts. When you make it through, Standing Bear corrected with quiet confidence. Paiute spirits travel with the righteous. They departed at dawn, taking the old smuggler's trail that wound treacherously through the Sierra Nevada toward the California border. Hank rode point, his experienced eyes constantly scanning for dangers both natural and man-made. Fernando rode rear guard with the hunting rifle, learning responsibility the hard way. Between them, Elena kept the younger children close and safe, Esperanza riding with her, Rosa staying near Miguel. The trail was treacherous beyond description. Narrow ledges with 1,000-foot drops into rocky canyons, loose shale that could send a horse tumbling to its death, hidden Indian strongholds where unfriendly bands might still be watching for trespassers. But Hank knew these mountains like other men knew their own backyards. He knew which waterholes were safe to drink from, which passes were regularly patrolled, which canyons offered genuine shelter from pursuit. On the second day, they encountered their first serious danger. Not Indians or Mexican bandits as expected, something potentially worse. A detachment of 2nd Cavalry had somehow gotten ahead of them, blocking the main trail through Devil's Gate Pass. Hank called a halt and studied the military situation through his field glasses. 25 troopers at minimum, strategically positioned to control the only reasonable pass into California. No way around without adding 5 days to their journey through country that would kill them slowly, and they didn't have 5 days worth of water for such a detour. ¿Qué hacemos ahora? Elena asked quietly, her voice tight with controlled fear. Hank lowered the glasses, his mind working through tactical options that all seemed impossible. Then he made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over 20 years in dangerous country. We go straight through their position. Through the soldiers? Sometimes the boldest move is the only smart move available. He dismounted and began changing into clothes he'd carried in his pack. A faded but clean cavalry uniform from his service during the Indian campaigns, complete with the stripes of a master sergeant and campaign ribbons that told the story of a distinguished military career. The transformation was remarkable. The mountain man disappeared, replaced by a soldier who commanded respect. "Fernando, you and Miguel stay back with your mother and the little ones. If this goes badly, you ride hard for the California line. Don't stop, don't look back, don't try to help me." Hank mounted up and rode straight toward the cavalry checkpoint, his military bearing clearly visible in the morning sunlight. As he approached, he could see confusion spreading through the soldiers' ranks. Here was a master sergeant, alone, riding toward them like he had every right to be there. The lieutenant in command, a young man with sandy hair and nervous eyes, rode out to meet him halfway. "Halt. State your business and authority, Sergeant." "Hunter, Henry Hunter, civilian scout under contract to Colonel Morrison's command," Hank replied, saluting properly despite his civilian status. "Escorting a family of Mexican nationals to California territory under special protective orders." The lieutenant returned the salute automatically, military protocol overriding his suspicion. "I'm afraid I can't allow passage, Sergeant. We have specific orders to detain any family matching certain descriptions." "Lieutenant," Hank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of long experience, "I've guided supply trains through hostile territory, tracked down lost cavalry patrols, and kept settlers alive in country that would swallow a regiment. I've taken Indian arrows and Mexican steel protecting folks who couldn't protect themselves. Now I'm asking for safe passage to get one family through to safety. Soldier to soldier." The young officer looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly out of his depth. Behind him, Hank could see other soldiers recognizing his uniform and reputation. One trooper raised a subtle hand in greeting, a man Hank had guided safely through Apache territory 2 years earlier. "My orders are quite specific, Sergeant. Your orders come from politicians who never rode these trails or faced these dangers," Hank replied firmly. "I'm asking you to be a soldier and a man of honor, not just a follower of paperwork." The lieutenant hesitated, and Hank pressed his advantage. "That family behind me? The mother's a widow who lost her husband in a mine collapse. Children never harmed anyone in their lives. They're being sold like livestock to pay company debts they never created. That's not justice, Lieutenant. That's just greed dressed up in legal language." Behind the lieutenant, the trooper who'd recognized Hank spoke up boldly. "Sergeant Hunter? Is that really you?" The soldier rode forward, a corporal Hank remembered from a difficult rescue mission. "Heard you left government service after the Apache campaigns ended." "Jake? Jake Sullivan from the supply train rescue?" "Yes, sir. You saved my entire detail when we got lost in that blizzard. This man's word is gold, Lieutenant." The lieutenant looked between them, clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties. He was young, probably fresh from military academy back east, trying to balance written orders against the obvious respect his experienced men had for this legendary scout. "Sergeant Hunter," he said finally, choosing his words carefully, "I'm going to conduct a routine inspection of your party for contraband and illegal weapons. Standard security procedure. If I find nothing irregular, you'll be free to proceed to your stated destination." Hank understood perfectly. The lieutenant was offering him a face-saving way out of an impossible situation. "Much appreciated, sir." The inspection was thoroughly perfunctory. The lieutenant examined the family's meager possessions, asked meaningless questions about their destination and purpose, and found absolutely nothing irregular about a civilian scout escorting Mexican nationals to California territory under protective authority. "Safe travels, Sergeant," he said, saluting once more. Hank returned the salute crisply, then rode back to collect the anxious family. As they passed through the checkpoint in single file, Corporal Sullivan rode alongside for a private moment. "Sergeant, you should know, word came down that Marshal Black's been reassigned to desk duty back east. Seems Colonel Morrison had some very strong words with the territorial prosecutors about harassing civilian scouts and their families." Hank nodded gratefully. "Tell the colonel I said thanks when you see him." "Will do, sir." "And Sergeant? If you ever want to return to government service, they're always looking for experienced scouts for the California expeditions. Could use a man of your reputation." "I'll keep that possibility in mind, Corporal." They crossed into California 3 days later at a remote mountain settlement called Pine Ridge. The local sheriff, a grizzled former prospector who'd seen everything twice, barely glanced at their traveling papers. Hank had prepared documentation identifying himself as a guide escorting a Mexican family to relatives in the Sacramento Valley. "Purpose of visit to California?" the sheriff asked routinely. "New start," Hank replied. "Fresh beginning." It was the absolute truth, in ways he was still learning to understand fully. The settlement of Pine Ridge consisted of little more than 24 log buildings clustered around a muddy main street, but it felt like sanctuary after months of running and hiding. American miners and loggers mingled freely with Mexican workers and Chinese immigrants, all united by the common struggle to wrest a living from unforgiving mountain country. Children played in the streets, speaking a mixture of languages, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about proper documentation or immigration status. Hank found them rooms at a small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Margaret O'Brien, who took one look at Elena and the children and quoted a price so reasonable it was practically charity disguised as business. "Your little ones," she said in a thick Irish accent, "they need proper food and warm beds. You pay what you can when you're able. Times are hard for everyone." That first week in California was like learning to breathe freely again after months of holding their breath. The children played without constantly looking over their shoulders for pursuit. Elena laughed out loud when Esperanza tried to catch the boarding house cat. Even Hank found himself sleeping through entire nights without waking to check for approaching danger. But their small savings were running dangerously low, and Hank knew they couldn't impose on Mrs. O'Brien's kindness indefinitely. He began asking around town about work opportunities, available land, and chances for a family to establish themselves permanently. That's when he encountered Samuel Big Sam Rodriguez. Big Sam owned a vast cattle ranch in the fertile valleys east of Pine Ridge, raising beef for the mining camps and growing communities throughout Northern California. He was a stocky man with intelligent eyes and hands scarred by decades of honest labor. He'd come west during the gold rush, failed as a prospector, succeeded as a merchant, and eventually built his fortune in cattle and land. "I hear you're seeking steady work and land to settle," he said to Hank over coffee in the local saloon. "I hear also you were a military scout, good with weapons and tracking. 20 years in the mountains, government and civilian service both. And the family traveling with you? They're under your protection." Hank paused, recognizing that the question carried more weight than appeared on the surface. "They're family now. My responsibility and my choice." Big Sam nodded approvingly. "In this country, we understand that kind of responsibility. Family isn't just blood relations, right? It's also commitment and choice." He leaned forward conspiratorially. "I have a proposition for you. I need a reliable man to manage the northern section of my ranch operation. Wild country, occasional trouble with rustlers and claim jumpers, but good land with excellent water rights. You interested in hearing details? What about the family?" "Family comes along naturally. I'll build you a proper house, solid construction. You work the land and manage that section, I pay fair wages, and after 7 years the land becomes yours with clear legal title. Papers, deed, everything legitimate under California law." Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope for a future instead of just day-to-day survival in the present. "Why would you make such an offer to complete strangers?" Big Sam's eyes grew distant with old memories. "Had a partner once during the gold rush. Good man, honest as the day is long. He protected a family of Chinese immigrants when the other miners wanted to drive them out. Got himself killed defending them, but the family survived and prospered." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I couldn't save my partner, But maybe I can honor his memory by helping another man who protects those who can't protect themselves. That night, Hank discussed the offer thoroughly with Elena. They sat on the boarding house's small porch, Esperanza asleep in her lap, the other children finally resting peacefully in real beds for the first time in what felt like years. "Confías en este hombre?" she asked carefully. "I do trust him. Man's got honest eyes and a firm handshake. And he's absolutely right about one thing: we need our own land to make a genuine fresh start. And if the federal authorities come looking for us here? California law is different from territorial law. And Big Sam seems to have real influence with the local government officials." Elena looked out over the quiet settlement, weighing their limited options carefully. The children need stability and security. Fernando needs to learn a proper trade instead of just survival skills. Miguel needs formal schooling. Rosa needs to be a normal little girl instead of always watching for danger. "What about you personally? What do you need most?" She was quiet for a long moment, thinking deeply. "I need to stop being afraid every moment of every day," she said finally. "I need to feel like we truly belong somewhere instead of just hiding." They shook hands with Big Sam the following morning, sealing the agreement with the gravity it deserved. By afternoon, they were riding east through some of the most beautiful country any of them had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in oak trees and wildflowers, valleys green with spring grass and clear streams, distant mountains purple against a sky so blue it seemed painted by angels. The ranch house Big Sam had promised was simple but beautifully constructed, thick log walls chinked with local clay, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire space, and a covered porch that faced east toward the sunrise over the mountains. Behind it stood a solid barn, split-rail corrals, and a small bunkhouse for seasonal workers. A creek ran nearby, clear and cold from mountain snowmelt, perfect for irrigation and livestock. "Es hermosa," Rosa whispered when she first saw their new home. Hank had to agree completely. After months of uncertainty, constant movement, and fear, the simple ranch house felt like a palace built specifically for their needs. Big Sam had been absolutely true to his word in every detail. The house came furnished with essential necessities, beds with real mattresses, a solid dining table and chairs, proper cooking equipment, even some books in both Spanish and English for the children's education. The barn contained quality tools, horse tack, and 5 horses that came with the arrangement. "The northern section extends from this creek all the way to those hills you can see," Big Sam explained, pointing across the wide valley. "Roughly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land. Some farmable bottom land near the water sources. In 7 years, all yours if you work it properly and meet your obligations." "What's the hidden cost?" Hank asked directly. 2 decades of mountain living had taught him to look for the catch in every deal that seemed too good to be true. Rustlers come through sometimes from the high country. Mostly they want cattle, but sometimes they take more than livestock. You keep them away, protect the herds and the other ranch workers, and this land will make you a wealthy man in time. It wasn't charity disguised as kindness, it was honest business. Hank would earn his place here through work and protection. That arrangement suited him perfectly. The first month passed in a whirlwind of learning new skills and adapting to different challenges. Hank had grown up on his family's small farm in Missouri before the war, but managing 2,000 acres of California ranch land presented entirely different problems and opportunities. Big Sam sent his experienced vaqueros to teach the mountain man about cattle behavior, horse breeding, and the particular challenges of California's unique climate and terrain. Fernando proved himself a natural horseman and threw himself enthusiastically into learning the vaquero arts: roping, branding, reading cattle sign, and managing large herds. Miguel discovered he possessed an almost supernatural gift for training horses and spent countless hours in the corrals working with young colts and fillies. Even Rosa learned to ride fearlessly, sitting her horse like she'd been born to it. Elena transformed their house into a genuine home with remarkable speed and skill. She planted an extensive garden using seeds Big Sam provided, learned to cook with local ingredients that were often unfamiliar, and began seriously teaching the younger children to read and write in both Spanish and English. Esperanza, now 5 years old, adapted fastest of all, chattering away in rapid English with the ranch hands and calling Hank Papa Henry as naturally as breathing. For Hank, the change was profound and life-altering. After 20 years of solitary mountain life, following animal trails, camping alone, working for other men's goals, having responsibility for land and family filled a void in his soul he hadn't even known existed. He woke before dawn not to plan another day of survival, but to the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through valley oak trees. He fell asleep not to the lonely silence of mountain camps, but to the quiet breathing of children safe and secure in their beds. But the California frontier was never completely peaceful for long, and trouble had a way of finding good people no matter how far they ran from it. It was Esperanza who first spotted the ominous smoke on the horizon, a thick, dark column rising from the direction of Big Sam's main ranch house 20 miles south through the valley. Hank was breaking horses in the corral when the little girl came running across the yard, chattering in rapid Spanish about humo negro, mucho humo malo. Hank climbed quickly to the cabin roof and looked through his field glasses with growing alarm. The smoke was far too thick and black to be normal cooking fires or forge work. Something substantial was burning that definitely shouldn't be. "Fernando," he called down urgently. "Saddle 3 of our fastest horses. Right now." They rode hard toward Big Sam's main ranch headquarters, Hank leading the desperate charge, Fernando and Miguel following on their best mounts. As they crested the last ridge before the valley floor, the scene spread below made Hank's blood run cold as mountain snow. The main house was completely engulfed in flames, fire licking through the wooden roof and consuming everything inside. Bodies lay scattered throughout the yard, vaqueros, house servants, even some of the ranch dogs. At least 40 bandits swarmed the property like locusts, loading wagons with silver, furniture, artwork, anything of value they could carry. And tied to posts directly in front of the burning house were Big Sam and his entire family. Hank had seen plenty of violence during his years as a scout, had fought hostile Indians, tracked down murderous claim jumpers, survived encounters with every variety of dangerous predator the mountains produced. But the sight of his generous benefactor bound and helpless while his home burned around him triggered something deeper than tactical thinking or survival instinct. It triggered pure, righteous fury. "Stay back and keep low," he ordered the boys grimly. "This is man's work, and it's going to get bloody." He circled wide around the ranch buildings, using the thick smoke as cover, and dismounted in a grove of oak trees roughly 200 yards from the main house. The enormous Sharp's rifle felt familiar and comforting in his hands as he settled into a sniper's position he'd used countless times against hostile targets. The first shot dropped the bandit leader clean off his horse with a .50 caliber bullet through the chest. The second shot scattered the men looting the barn, sending them diving for cover. Hank worked the single-shot rifle methodically, each shot carefully aimed, each target chosen for maximum tactical disruption. He wasn't shooting to wound when possible. These weren't confused settlers or frightened Indians, but professional criminals who'd chosen their path. The bandits returned fire wildly, shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows in the smoke. Hank changed positions constantly, using movement techniques the Apache had taught him through painful experience during his scouting days. A shot from the oak grove, then quick movement to the stone wall, then to the creek bed, always staying ahead of their attempts to locate him. Within 15 minutes, more than half the bandits were dead or seriously wounded, the survivors in full panicked retreat toward the high country. Hank emerged from cover and ran to where Big Sam was tied to the post, working frantically to cut the ropes. "Estás herido, amigo?" he asked in Spanish, his hands working quickly. "Bruised and mad as hell, but alive thanks to you," Big Sam replied breathlessly. "My family. All safe now. The house can be rebuilt." Big Sam embraced him like a long-lost brother. "You saved our lives, Henry. How can I possibly repay such a debt?" "No debt between friends and partners," Hank replied firmly. But privately, he understood that the attack had changed everything about their situation. The bandits would certainly return in greater numbers once they regrouped. The ranch was no longer the safe haven they'd hoped to find. That evening, as they helped fight the last stubborn flames and tended to the wounded survivors, Big Sam made an announcement that surprised everyone present. "I'm getting too old for this kind of life. he said wearily. Too old to fight bandits every few months, too tired to rebuild everything over and over again. I have an important decision to make about the future. He turned to face Hank directly. I want you to own the entire ranch operation. Not just the northern section we agreed on. Of it. I'll sell the whole spread to you at a fair price, with clear California papers, everything completely legal and above board. Hank stared in amazement. Big Sam, I couldn't possibly afford. You pay what you can when you're able. The rest you pay through work, through protection, through making this land safe for families to live and prosper again. The older man clasped his shoulder firmly. You've already proven you'll fight and kill to protect this place. That's worth more than money could ever be. The legal papers were signed the following week in the county courthouse at Sacramento. Elena stood proudly beside Hank as he signed his name to deeds that made them legitimate landowners in California, citizens with full rights and legal protections under state and federal law. But their biggest and most dangerous test was still approaching from the east. 2 months later, as autumn painted the hills in brilliant gold and red, American federal forces appeared on the eastern horizon. Not a simple patrol this time, a full military expedition. Captain Morrison led them personally, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a federal prosecutor, a territorial judge, and 50 cavalry troopers in full campaign gear. They established a formal military camp just outside the ranch boundaries, close enough to be clearly visible but not close enough to constitute trespassing on private property. For 3 tense days they waited, the implied threat clear but unspoken. On the 4th day, Captain Morrison rode to the ranch boundary alone under a white flag of truce. Hank met him there, both men stopping precisely at the property line marked by a simple stone cairn. Hank, Morrison said wearily, looking older than his years. They're ordering me to request that you surrender yourself and the family. Face the charges through proper legal channels. What specific charges? Theft of indentured servants. Interference with federal commerce authority. Inciting rebellion against territorial law. And if I refuse the request? Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable with his orders. They'll pressure the California state government, threaten federal funding, create border disputes with Nevada territory, make it expensive for California to harbor fugitives from federal justice. Hank considered this carefully. He'd found genuine peace here, built something worth protecting and defending. But was it morally right to risk conflict between governments for personal happiness? Captain, you know as well as I do that what happened in Virginia City wasn't theft. It was rescue of innocent people. I know that. You know that. Hell, any decent man knows that. But the lawyers and politicians in Washington see things very differently. Give me 2 days to consider my options. Morrison nodded reluctantly. 2 days. Then I'll have to follow my direct orders regardless of personal feelings. That night, Hank walked the entire ranch boundaries under starlight, thinking hard about impossible choices. The land was beautiful beyond description, the family was safe and thriving, and he'd found something he'd never expected to possess, a true home and people who depended on him. But was he being selfish to risk interstate conflict for personal fulfillment? The answer came from an unexpected source. Esperanza, now chattering in fluent English, ran to him across the moonlit pasture with a wildflower clutched carefully in her small fist. Papa Henry! Mira esto! She held up the flower with pride. Rosa says this flower means home forever. Yes, verdad? Hank knelt and accepted the flower with appropriate solemnity. Si, hijita. It means home forever. Looking into the child's trusting eyes, completely innocent of the larger political forces threatening their small world, he understood something fundamental about his situation. This wasn't really about him anymore. It wasn't about his past or his pride or even his deeply held principles. It was about Esperanza calling him Papa. About Fernando learning to be a man on land he could inherit legally. About Miguel finding his true calling with horses. About Rosa growing up without constant fear. It was about Elena humming contentedly as she cooked dinner, her voice carrying across the valley like a promise that tomorrow would indeed be better than today. The next morning, Hank rode to the boundary fence alone. Captain Morrison was waiting as agreed, along with the federal prosecutor and the territorial judge, all mounted and ready for his final decision. "Well?" Morrison asked without preamble. "I've got an answer for you," Hank said steadily. "But first I have a question for all of you. Do any of you gentlemen have children of your own?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I don't see how that's relevant to legal proceedings." "Children, yes or no?" Morrison nodded reluctantly. "3 boys and a girl." "And you?" Hank looked directly at the judge. "2 daughters and a son." "Then you understand perfectly what I'm about to tell you. That family on my ranch? Those children call this place home now. They're safe, they're happy, they're growing up free and learning to read and write. I'm not going to tear them up by the roots again just to satisfy some paper pushers in Washington who've never met them and never will." The prosecutor's face flushed red with indignation. "Mr. Hunter, you are in clear violation of federal statutes regarding." "Federal authority ends at my property line," Hank interrupted firmly, pointing to the boundary marker. "On this side, I'm a California citizen protecting my family on my own legally purchased land." "California citizen?" The judge leaned forward skeptically. "You can't simply declare." Hank pulled out his citizenship papers, properly stamped and sealed by California territorial authorities. Legal residency established through land purchase and oath of allegiance. Everything proper and legitimate under California territorial law. Morrison examined the papers carefully and thoroughly. "These documents are completely legitimate." "Of course they are. California doesn't play political games with citizenship like some territories do." The prosecutor sputtered angrily. "This is absolutely preposterous. You can't simply escape federal justice by changing your legal residence." "What justice?" Hank's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "Justice would have been those children staying with their mother instead of being sold like livestock at public auction. Justice would have been that mining company paying living wages instead of creating debt slavery. What you're calling justice is just corporate revenge with a federal badge pinned to it." Morrison carefully folded the citizenship papers and handed them back respectfully. "Hank, you know I have genuine respect for you. But my direct orders from superior officers. Your orders are to arrest me and return me for trial. Well, here I am, standing right here at my property line. You want to arrest me? Step across that boundary marker and try it." The 3 federal officials looked at each other with growing frustration. They could see the ranch house in the distance, smoke rising peacefully from its chimney, children playing safely in the yard. And they could see Hank Hunter standing confidently on California soil, no longer a fugitive but a legal resident with full rights and constitutional protections. Finally, the judge spoke with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Hunter, if you ever set foot in Nevada territory again, these federal charges will be waiting for you. Understood and accepted. And if any member of that family ever crosses back into territorial jurisdiction, they're California residents now too. Got their papers filed yesterday at the county courthouse." The prosecutor cursed bitterly under his breath. After all their effort, all their legal maneuvering and federal threats, they'd accomplished absolutely nothing except turning potential allies into permanent enemies of federal authority. Captain Morrison saluted one final time with obvious regret. "Henry, I'm truly sorry it came to this situation." Hank returned the salute crisply. "No apology necessary, Captain. You followed your orders. I followed my conscience." The federal expedition rode away that same afternoon, leaving only settling dust on the horizon and the promise of a border that would be watched more carefully from then on. But they left Hank Hunter and his adopted family in complete peace. The years that followed were unquestionably the best and most fulfilling of Hank's entire life. The ranch prospered tremendously under his experienced management. The cattle herds grew fat and healthy on mountain grass and valley hay. The horses he and Miguel trained together became famous throughout Northern California for their intelligence, endurance, and gentle temperament. Buyers came from as far away as San Francisco and Los Angeles to purchase their superior stock. Fernando married the daughter of a neighboring rancher and built his own substantial home on the eastern section of their property. He learned to read and write fluently in both languages, eventually becoming a respected leader in the local community and serving as an elected county supervisor. Miguel opened an independent horse training operation that attracted customers from throughout the western states. Rosa grew into a young woman of remarkable beauty and sharp intelligence, equally comfortable discussing literature with traveling professors or working cattle alongside experienced vaqueros. Esperanza became Hank's constant shadow and devoted student, learning everything the legendary mountain man could teach about horses, cattle, land management, and the kind of personal honor that couldn't be bought, sold, or compromised. She spoke 3 languages fluently: Spanish, English, and enough Paiute to trade successfully with the bands that still moved seasonally through the high country. Elena bloomed like a desert flower after life-giving rain. Her impressive size, which had made her a target in the narrow social confines of Virginia City, became a tremendous asset in the wide open spaces of the California ranch. She could work alongside any man on the property, command instant respect from the toughest vaqueros, and still cook magnificent feasts that drew visitors from neighboring ranches just to taste her legendary enchiladas and tamales. She and Hank never married legally. The complications of his unclear legal status during their flight and her widowhood made formal marriage difficult to arrange. But in every way that truly mattered, they became husband and wife. Their love was built on shared struggle, mutual respect, and the daily choice to stand together against whatever challenges the frontier could throw at them. Hank taught her to ride like a cavalry trooper and shoot with military precision. She taught him to cook like a Mexican grandmother and find profound joy in small daily moments. Esperanza's infectious laughter, Rosa's beautiful singing voice, the peaceful sound of cattle lowing contentedly in the evening air. They attended services together at the local Protestant church, Hank one of the few former mountain men in the congregation but welcomed warmly by the minister and parishioners who knew his reputation for absolute fairness and quiet generosity. When drought threatened the entire valley, he organized volunteer work crews to dig irrigation ditches that saved everyone's crops. When rustlers raided neighboring ranches, he led armed posses of ranchers and vaqueros to drive them permanently out of the territory. The children grew into truly remarkable adults who exceeded everyone's expectations. Fernando became a successful rancher in his own right and was eventually elected to the California territorial legislature. Miguel's innovative horse training methods spread throughout the western states, and he was regularly consulted by military officers and wealthy landowners. Rosa married a young lawyer from San Francisco and moved to the city, but she visited frequently with her own growing family. Esperanza followed directly in Hank's footsteps, becoming one of the few female guides and trackers in the territory, specializing in finding lost travelers and leading rescue expeditions. Hank aged gracefully and contentedly, his black hair turning iron gray and then silver white, his mountain man's swagger settling into the confident stride of a successful ranch owner. But his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's, and his reputation for protection and fair dealing grew steadily throughout Northern California. Refugees, outcasts, and families fleeing various troubles found their way to his ranch, knowing they would find honest work and genuine shelter if they were willing to contribute their fair share. Years passed like seasons in a good climate, each one bringing new challenges to overcome and new rewards to enjoy. Hank never returned to Nevada territory, but he followed news from across the state line through newspapers and visiting travelers. The Consolidated Silver Company eventually collapsed completely under the weight of its own corruption and mismanagement. Marshall Black was stripped of his federal badge for falsifying official reports and died drunk in a Denver gutter. The auction block in Virginia City was torn down and replaced with a proper schoolhouse for local children. Sometimes former scouts and mountain men would visit the ranch, bringing news and sharing memories of their dangerous adventures together. Hank would cook them thick steaks, share his best whiskey, and listen to stories of expeditions and campaigns he'd missed. But he never felt even a moment's regret about his life choices. One peaceful evening in his 68th year, Hank sat on his porch watching Esperanza play with her own children in the yard, 4 grandchildren who called him abuelo and spoke of him with the same reverence their mother had always shown. Elena, now gray-haired but still strong and vital, brought him coffee and settled comfortably into the chair beside him. "¿Qué piensas, mi amor?" she asked gently. "I'm thinking about that terrible day in Virginia City," he replied thoughtfully. "The auction block. How terrified those children looked standing there. And now?" He gestured toward the yard where Fernando was patiently teaching his oldest son to rope a fence post, where Rosa's daughter was helping Miguel curry horses in the evening light, where Esperanza's boys chased chickens while their mother scolded them gently in 2 languages. Now I'm thinking about how one single moment can change absolutely everything. How $30 I almost didn't have became the best investment any man ever made. You remember the exact amount after all these years? Best $30 ever spent in my entire life. She leaned against his shoulder, both of them weathered by sun and wind and the passage of time, but still solid, still together, still choosing each other every day. ¿Alguna vez te arrepientes de tu decisión? Do you ever regret your decision? Hank looked out over the valley that had become his kingdom. Thousands of acres of prime California land, herds that bore his registered brand, children and grandchildren who carried his name and his values confidently into an uncertain future. He thought about the alternative life he might have lived as a solitary mountain man growing old alone in some remote cabin, drinking away his memories of violence and loneliness. No, mi amor. Never once. Not for a single day. As the sun set majestically behind the coastal mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that took your breath away, Hank reflected on the strange and wonderful turns his life had taken. He'd started as a poor farm boy in Missouri, survived a brutal war, earned respect as a mountain guide and tracker, and found love as a protector of strangers who'd become his chosen family. The auction block in Virginia City had been designed to sell human beings like livestock. Instead, it had become the moment when a lost family found their guardian and a lonely guardian discovered his true purpose in life. In the distance, church bells rang from the town of Pine Ridge, calling people to evening prayers and community gathering. Hank didn't always pray in the formal church building. He found God more easily in the mountains, in the satisfaction of honest work completed, in the joyful laughter of children who'd never known slavery or shame or the fear of being sold. But that night, as Elena's weathered hand found his and their grandchildren's voices carried on the evening breeze like music, he offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the courage to speak when silence would have been safer, for the family that had made his soul complete, and for the land that had allowed them all to become who they were truly meant to be. The next morning brought new visitors to the ranch, not soldiers or marshals this time, but a desperate young family fleeing debt slavery from the Colorado mining camps. They were exhausted, frightened, carrying nothing but the ragged clothes on their backs and fragile hope for a new beginning somewhere. Hank met them at the main gate, just as he had met countless other refugees over the years. He looked carefully at their faces, husband, wife, 3 small children, and saw himself and Elena and her children from all those dangerous years ago. "Need work?" he asked in English, then repeated the question in Spanish. The man nodded eagerly, almost desperately. "Yes, sir, anything at all. We'll work harder than anyone, I promise you that. Can you handle cattle and horses?" "I can learn whatever you need me to learn, sir." Hank smiled, thinking of Big Sam's incredible kindness all those years ago, thinking of Captain Morrison's crucial mercy, thinking of Chief Standing Bear's unexpected honor, thinking of all the good people who'd chosen basic humanity over strict law, compassion over cold convenience. "Well then," he said, swinging the gate wide open, "welcome home to your new life." And the circle completed itself once more, as all good circles do when they're built on love instead of law, on conscious choice instead of random chance, on the deep understanding that family isn't just blood relations. It's the people you choose to stand beside when the world tries its hardest to break you down. Hank Bigfoot Hunter had learned that fundamental lesson on an auction block in Virginia City, but he'd been teaching it ever since on a ranch in California where children grew up free and grandparents told stories of the day a mountain man decided that some things were worth infinitely more than personal peace and safety. 30 silver dollars had purchased their freedom from legal slavery. But it was love, commitment, and daily choice that had made them all truly rich. The legend of Hank Bigfoot Hunter and the Ramirez family spread throughout the Western Territories, told in saloons and around campfires from Texas to Oregon. Not because it was extraordinary in the telling, though it certainly was, but because it was absolutely necessary in the living. Because in a world that too often treated people like disposable property, someone had to stand up publicly and say no with force behind it. Someone had to prove beyond doubt that a family's worth couldn't be measured in silver dollars, that personal honor mattered more than written orders, and that sometimes the most important law was the one written permanently on the human heart. Hank Bigfoot Hunter had proven all of that and infinitely more. He'd taken 4 complete strangers and made them his beloved children. He'd taken foreign soil and made it his permanent homeland. He'd taken a simple act of moral defiance and turned it into a legacy that would outlive them all by generations. And every sunset, as he sat contentedly on his porch watching his grandchildren play safely in the yard where cattle grazed peacefully and horses ran free, he remembered the auction block in Virginia City and smiled with deep satisfaction. Because you can't put a price on genuine family. And you sure as hell can't buy it with money. You claim it through choice. You fight for it with everything you have. You build it carefully, one day at a time, with love and commitment and shared struggle. And if you're very lucky, luckier than most people ever dream of being, it claims you right back with the same fierce loyalty. Hank Bigfoot Hunter was lucky enough to learn that lesson when it mattered most. And it saved his life just as surely as it saved theirs. In the end, 30 silver dollars had bought freedom for 5 people. But the love that grew from that desperate moment had enriched countless lives across 2 generations and would continue echoing through the mountains and valleys of California for as long as people remembered that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The mountain man had found his family. The family had found their protector. And together, they had built something that neither law nor politics nor corporate greed could ever touch or destroy. That was the true legend of Hank Bigfoot Hunter, not the tracking skills or the marksmanship or the reputation for toughness, but the moment he chose love over safety and changed 5 lives forever, including his own.